back to order.
And Bruce knows that.
Yeah, it was working. It was working.
Really don't think you can just turn over this survey and go home?
I wish, Terrence. All right, we're calling it back to order. I want to turn it back over to Patty to lead us forward from here.
Okay, great. First of all, it always amazes me how well Chris Tatham can take numbers and tell a story, and how you can use those numbers and that information as you go ahead in terms of prioritizing. So, as I said, I'm just always amazed, and that was great information, and I'm glad that you all obviously thought so as well in terms of going forward. So, it's somebody else's turn to tell a story now. And that is Mr. Lou Levin, along with Commissioner McKiernan. Some of this information I believe that you have already received, but we just wanted to go ahead and again do a review of how you ended the year 2013 and what those trends look like. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Lou. Or Commissioner McKiernan.
We need another mic. Can we pass one of your two
There you
microphones down there?
Well, I'll just set up. If you remember back in October, since, as Commissioner Murguia has pointed out, I don't have anything better to do on Saturday nights, I sat around and I made up a spreadsheet because we talk about a lot of big dollar things. We talk about CMIP, we talk about things like the BPU pilot, we talk about the mill levy, and we talk about making changes in those big things. And I was always wondering, well, what does a change in one factor, how does that play out over time? What if we changed it by 0.5%? Or what if we changed it by $1 million? And so I built a very simplistic little spreadsheet that looked at income and expense trends, what ifs, over time, and I built it out to 2022, and I presented it to all of you on our October retreat. And it was interesting to see. I think the mayor termed it the alligator with income and expense. It was interesting to see the alligator, but to have a tool to evaluate the real impact of some of these changes that we talk about. So Mr. Levin and Reggie and Debbie really have taken what I started out with and gone to the next level with it and started to create a much more sophisticated model that allows us to ask, well, what if such and such changes by 1%? How does that play out over time? So what they're going to do today is they're going to present to us their more sophisticated model that I think will be a great tool for us to be very strategic about what kinds of changes we make in income and expense categories. So I'll turn it over to them.
Thank you, Commissioner. What we've tried to put together is to address a couple different things. First, we're going to review where we ended the year, talk a little bit what comprises our current budget, and then move into a forecast. And when we get into the forecast, you'll see some numbers, and we'll try to indicate what our assumptions are. But generally, at this time of the year, when we begin to prepare a budget, budgets tend to look, I'll say, more challenging, because the assumptions are we have we're going to spend, if we continue to spend at the level where we are, and we fully spend on the capital improvements that are in our plan, and revenues come in conservatively, then our gap, or what Commissioner McKiernan referred to, this difference becomes greater. So you'll see that, but anyways, for our purpose, we tried to do a forecast for actually 2015 through 2017. To begin with, the first slide has a 2014 approved budget, and we tried to identify the funds that really make up the major part of the budget. You see the general funds, which include the city and county general fund, as well as consolidated parks, almost a little under $200 million of that, I'm going to say $300 million budget. Then the next two largest funds, sewer system fund and bond and interest fund, just under $30 million. We have the EMS fund. That's approximately $8 million. Dedicated sales tax, a little under $7 million. In special city street and highway, about $6.5 million. And then you see all other all other funds, which include a series of funds: the Health Department Fund, Aging, Election, Disabilities Fund. So there's probably about 15 other funds in that all other category. So that's where we are today. How we ended the year, Debbie had presented a summary of totals a couple weeks to you. Some of the key numbers we tried to focus on were beginning fund balance, where we started the year 2012, where we ended it. We had a gain in fund balance. We certainly had a interesting discussion on fund balance, and Thursday evening, going into 2013, we were at just a little under, and this is the consolidated general fund, we were a little under 10 million. Revenues were less than expenditures, a decline in fund balance, and where we stand on a budget basis, fund balance as a percent of expenditures. 2014 budget, we've added, and these are the budgeted figures for 2014 based on our preliminary estimate. We see a further decline in our ending fund balance from at the $6 million level to approximately 2.6 million. I've highlighted this change here. That increase due to a couple different factors. We have a 1% COLA built into the budget, and we have from the state a higher contribution rate for CAPERS, in particular for the area of public safety, police, and fire, and that's a one-time expense that we're addressing this year.
So you believe that $4 million hit in fund balance is a one-time expense? All of it?
No, what's the one-time expense is that higher contribution rate for CAPERS in the area of police and fire. It's based upon I'll say costs associated with employees at retirement, and we were able to finance it over a period of years. The cost, the excess cost related to the pension requirements for those individuals on the CAPERS side, and that's this year was the last year we were able to finance that. In 2015, we'll fall back to the state rate, and so and that precipitated the need to, if you remember in this year's budget, we have a $3 million that we have as a line item in the budget as a transfer from the sewer service fund to the general fund.
Okay, thank you.
Is that $3 million? Is the $3 million about the one-time hit that we're going to take?
Yeah, it's related to that CAPERS.
So the $3 million is the amount of the CAPERS issue?
Our CAPERS contribution rate for police and fire is approximately 6% higher this year in 2014 than it will be in 2015.
So is that about $3 million?
It's it's somewhere between $3 and $4 million.
Thank you.
I'll also note, Mr. Levin said 1% COLA. We just have a 1% bonus built in, so that's a one-time.
Thank you, Doug. Just to reiterate where our major revenue sources are: tax revenue, 80%, three main categories in tax revenue: property tax, sales tax, franchise. Franchise includes the BPU pilot payment. Property tax, the highest portion of that, but sales and franchise tax, significant portions of that. In terms of expenditures, major area we have is personnel. So if we're to maintain the same level of personnel across the organization, we're committing to over 75% of our costs. Go ahead, Commissioner.
I just want to make sure that everybody's clear that this is just the consolidated general funds. And this does not represent necessarily our breakdown across the whole $296 million budget, but just in the funds that are the largest part of that budget.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so from this point, we began as sort of a finance team to try to build a financial forecast 2015 through 2017. Not going to go through each of these, but you see we have a series of assumptions. We put in a 2% adjustment for payroll. We put in slightly under 2% as additional capers costs associated with that payroll increase, and then other assumptions across the organization. The way we set up this model, we can change these assumptions. On the revenue side, we assumed, we said, what if we hold the mill rate constant, we were able to have 2% revenue growth and property valuation, that we have sales tax growth across the organization, that STAR bonds are paid off in December 2016, resulting in money available in 2017, and then we had assumptions related to pilot revenue and other revenue sources. So what does that do to us? We see we have tax revenue increasing. That's the area there. So our total revenues from what's in the budget this year, 184 to 188 million. Our expenditures, we're at the 188 million now, and they're increasing to 195 million. We have a reduction here in personnel, and that's related to that capers reduction that I alluded to for on the police and fire side. What we have here, a couple numbers highlighted in red, and I'm sorry, they may be a little hard to read. One's capital outlay, and one's other, and this is, the capital outlay is what we approved in the CMIP, and it's at over a $7 million level. So this, and we look at this line here, we have a negative fund balance of 3.6 million. So this is what I'm going to present to our new administrator. I'm going to say we got to prepare a budget. I'm going to want a positive fund balance. This is where we are in trends. We got issues that maybe capital outlays, although this is what we have in the plan and we would like to have, we don't really have the ability to fund it at this time. And so if he tells me I still have a job, we'll try to address it. So we take the same scenario forward. We've showed you our assumptions. Revenue still increasing. Green is positive. And, you know, here green was positive, but now personnel goes back up. We still have an ambitious capital program. That one time in 2015, we paid back the sewer fund, so our other costs go down, which is a positive. But now our negative fund balance, if my eyesight's right, I'm going to have to look at this. 6.5 million. So then we'll take it to our next year, 2017, and here, this is great. Now we got that STAR bond money coming into the budget, and but we're not reducing property taxes. We've maintained this high level of capital expenditures. Personnel costs have continued to go up, and we have a balanced budget at this point. But we're not there yet in 2017. So this tells us we got changes, or we got difficult budgets still to go forward with 2015, 2016.
So based on your model, if we basically change nothing, by the time that new money comes in, it won't do any new initiatives. It will simply balance our budget.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, it's actually more than balancing our budget, because
It's re-
revenue at that time's 207 million, and our expenses are 201 million. You know, this is showing positive because we've entered with negatives. You know, we're not,
So it not
under
only,
state budget law, we cannot do this. We cannot have a budget where we're 3.6 million in the hole, and so,
and if our conversation on Thursday meant anything, we really can't even have it go down to 2.6 million in terms of our. That's exactly right.
That was a quick.
Kieran,
And if I could say, that's exactly the reason that I brought the model to the October meeting, because we talk about some things and they're very abstract. And I felt like we needed to make it real concrete. What happens if? And in this case, that's just balancing the budget. And we've talked about those monies in different ways. And so I thought we really need to look ahead with as concrete a model as possible so that we can go, oh, well.
So, Mayor, if we're unwilling to agree to spend in $3.5 million in excess of what we have and reduce fund balance, we have to find a way to cut that from the budget, which probably means personnel.
could be, it's a combination of sources. It
Well,
could-
I mean, there's, the only other one big
Yeah.
enough to handle it would appear to be contractual commitments.
Yeah.
Capital improvements. Okay?
Which, according to the survey, is your number one priority.
Dave might offer some other solutions. Our bond and interest fund, we've always taken this forward look on this fund. We've tried to limit what we finance on a debt basis, and we have a good forecast of what our future debt requirements are based on our existing bond issues. We have this fund in balance. We have a good fund balance, and we're able to maintain our mill rate. This is on the city side of the budget. On the county side of the budget, we discussed a month ago the impact of the radio project, where you see we're incurring debt on a couple sides. We began to incur the amount we funded last year on the Public Building Commission side. This is a net of $800,000, $1.1 million on the debt we just issued in the last month. On the general obligation side, this is the lease equipment associated with that upgrade, and what we've built into the budget, and these are numbers we have to live with. There's not really alternatives. Is a little over a $1 million increase in 2015, and then slight increases 2016, 2017. I'm going to turn this over to Dave, talk a little bit more about fund balance.
Dave McGilvery with Springstead, your financial advisor, and I can waive my time and have Doug explain how he's going to fix this.
no, go ahead.
Congratulations again. And nobody really gave me a script, but I'll try and be concise. I just want to go back to Thursday night in a little bit of overall context, because part of this is not only the unified government, but what other people in other places are doing. And I think this sort of tool of planning, I think, you've basically got three pieces. You have to have financial architecture, which is the alligator, and I assume the upper jaw is the expenditures, and the lower jaw is the revenues.
Unfortunately.
Something's in between. And so you need that. Then you need the toolbox of what tools you have, and whether, and a lot of people have been looking at the same types of numbers since the beginning of the recession. And then you have the outcome, and the outcome is delivery of services, meeting priorities, and financial numbers. In some ways, the fund balance is a barometer. Can you fund the services you need, do capital, and have a financial standing that is viable over the long time, so you don't have erratic changes. So that's sort of where you have to go. So the fund balance should be viewed as a barometer of the outcomes. I guess, and obviously, we're trying to close the alligator's mouth and do it in a way that meets the priorities and positions the unified government in a great spot. So it's how you're going to proceed to structural balance. And I just want, nobody gave me a script, which is sort of plus and minus maybe, and so, and I don't know what the,
We'll cut you off sometime before lunch.
I was concise in the first answer, I said yes. I will say that, just looking at it, and I don't know all the details, but basically, if you're spending $1, you're taxing 80 cents. Because 80% of every budget dollar comes from taxes. And you want to keep taxes down. So one would be, are there ways to diversify the revenue stream or pull expenditures out of what you're traditionally funding in the general fund and put them under a different revenue source? And I know a number of people, same sort of issues, but that sort of concentration of taxes. So every time you make an expenditure decision, you're making an 80-cent decision on raising taxes. So if you can change that dynamic a bit, I think that would be helpful. And I'll just, here again, I won't drift. I'll just throw out one idea. We saw the first priority was street and roads, and I know you've done some things, and you have a few different pots of money. I have one community, City of St. Paul. It's about the same size. It has about the same budget. It's across the river from a major city that gets a lot of headlines. And their revenue mix, they have about 25, funding mix of local governments in Minnesota is different. About 25% of their money comes from the state. State had a budget problem of what Lou has been talking about, $190 million a year. They didn't get $20 million from the state the last day of the budget year, and they didn't get the same amount the next 3 years. And so they had some radical thinking to do. And so they didn't control their own destinies. They tried to, and they have actually been able to build fund balance over those times. So they had some, big decisions. And there's no free lunch here. If you're going to do something, it's going to cost you. And here again, you may have tried these things, but they pulled same problem with the streets. We have winter there fairly severely, so snow plowing is considered a fairly basic service. They pulled everything to do with streets, overlay, grind and mill and overlay, snow plowing, the street sweeping out of the general fund, every dime. And they have a citywide sort of fee they propose, levy on everybody. And in St. Paul, 20% of the land area is in nonprofits, the state capital, 13 colleges, county seat, a lot of different archdioceses. They have so how do you have people that don't pay taxes, contribute to essential services? So that, as you look at your revenue mix. So I'm not saying that's the cure here. I'm just saying you had the number one priority with streets. You want to respond to that. If people want them, will they be willing to pay for them separately on a specific? And I know you passed a sales tax piece a while back that has items in there for neighborhood infrastructure. So I don't know. It's an idea that somebody else. I'm not saying they have the be-all, end-all, but it's the kind of thinking. How do you take a big chunk of money out of the general fund and move it somewhere else, and people see, I'm going to pay for this, I'm getting this. So just one answer.
We did a similar thing with the stormwater fee several years ago. I think that was 07 or 08, where we implemented a stormwater fee that affected all residents rather than, because a lot of our residents, a high percentage, are not on the tax base, and they're not on sewer. But stormwater runoff affects everyone. And so that's a similar example that we have implemented in the past, and now that's an integral part of our budget.
Particularly affects District 6, as we know from the survey.
That's right.
No, that's an excellent case, and so that's a good application of that. and here again, that's one story. I'm not, time is limited. I'm going to get back to whatever general script I had. But, so I heard all those things come together, and I thought it might be something. I'll just start with our discussion Thursday night, a little bit about that, and bring that back. Discussion there on credit rating, and just to me, the credit rating, it's, as I said, it's very positive to have as high a one as possible. I think generally a credit rating, I don't think you need to say it, we're doing this because of our credit rating. I think you need to make the decisions, we're doing this because it better positions our community financially. And you can talk about the credit rating because they provide some metrics, benchmarks, but, I think it's really, the reason those benchmarks are there is so investors know if you're in good financial standing or not in good financial standing. So I think, they should be looked at that way. I understand, so we get back then to the fund balance discussion and just get it out again. The Moody's folks, their report at least said that you're a negative outlook and a AA3 rating. If you don't balance your budget in 2014, there's a high likelihood that they will downgrade you to the A1 category. That's slipping from a relatively highly regarded credit rating to still a good credit rating, but those gaps cost a lot of interest rate, and if you have to borrow for it, that will result in property taxes, if indeed that debt's repaid by property tax, which puts pressure on your ability to raise taxes for operation, or just keep
It's a vicious cycle.
taxes where they are and not for
It's a vicious
operations.
cycle. It just gets worse and worse.
So they've thrown down that sort of gauntlet. So, I think as I went back to the financial architecture, how do you draw these lines and do the modeling that says if we do this, what happens? And you might have to think of some other ways to get there. That's why I threw out the street piece, because that's a structural piece with a lot of money that goes right to your number one priority. So I think you have to say, here's our plan. Generally, I think this is the UG's policy, but I think it's generally a good one for folks in Kansas. You should be looking at trying to get to 10% fund balance. That's provides you with capacity. And it's going to be a bit of a journey. You're not going to do it like this, because it's right now with those assumptions. I don't want, however you approach the capital outlay number, I think you have, do nothing, or it goes from 3 million to 7 million, right? So that's, a lot of people during the recession said, well, we'll just cut capital outlay. The issue is people want their streets to be fairly well maintained. So you have to look at ways to do that. I hate to, I'm certainly in the debt business, so I don't want to be perceived as that, but paying them out of current revenues when you've got a structural imbalance on a current basis, you may want to look at those different ways. So I don't know, Lou. The fund balance, as I said, is a barometer. You should be shooting for at least 10%. That's going to be a ways to get there. And it's going to be, it's said no free lunch, so whatever you do, you can, both the fixes have to be both on the revenue side and the expenditure side. So I don't know, Lou, if that's sufficient or too much.
We've spent a good bit of time just talking about fund balance, and really, and we have a couple terms up here. Fund balance is really the cash balance in the fund at the end of the year. But when we prepare the budget, we actually have, there's a couple components to it. We have non-appropriated fund balance, and that is money. We have an actual line item in the budget. We do not have authority to spend it. So we might say in our general fund, we're going to put as non-appropriated fund balance $1 million or $2 million. And then that money's automatically going to carry over to the end of the year. In addition, we have that structural balance, our revenues exceeding our expenditures, and if they do, then that will add further to the fund balance. One item we put in the budget is reserves or contingencies, and we've had, I'll say, only small discussion on that, and I think today's sort of an opportunity to discuss that further. Why do we want to budget reserves? And let me go back actually to, no, go back two more. In our general fund, we have, if my hand holds steady, $775,000 in reserves. That might seem like a large number, but we got a budget of nearly $200 million, and I'm going to get into why that's somewhat of problematic. Why do we want to budget reserves? We want to sustain certainly essential government operations, cover any shortfalls that occur. If we have a capital emergency, if we have a fire truck that gets damaged in an accident or a police vehicle that gets totaled, we have to have a funding source to pay for it. Sometimes we have disasters that might be flooding or damage from storm that we need to respond to. We may have a series of snowstorms one winter that are less than we budgeted, and we have excess overtime. We might have a new grant funding opportunity, and I think you've seen those come up in standing committee, and we say we have the opportunity to get a grant, and this grant's really going to be good, but it requires a $25,000 match. Where do we have money for that match? The commission might have changing budget priorities during the course of the year. We might actually have a meeting where they say, we want you to implement a fall survey. and that survey, the baseline of that survey might be $50,000, and then the commissioners say, well, we want even better response at the commission district. Very, very good priority. Dave said that's not unlikely to happen, but I might have to go to Reggie and say, where are we going to find $75,000? It's nice to have a line item under reserves or contingencies. Sometimes we have revenue shortfalls. We might have a major taxpayer that says, you know, maybe I'm not going to make my property tax payment this year, or sales tax revenues decline. We need the building in reserves into the budget gives us some level of comfort. When we have a budget of, you know, of 180 million, 190, I guess the number was 195 million. What level's desirable? And I just took, and I was working on this morning, and I said, well, if at least some level of comfort, if we built in a 3% factor for reserves, that we're talking about a number of $5 million plus, and you might remember what I started out with was 750,000. And when we build it into the budget, if we were really able to build in a line item of reserves contingencies of $5 million, our hope or intent would be that that $5 million would roll down to the bottom line and strengthen fund balance. But it's good to be there for the situations that I mentioned.
I just want to add to the way we do the reserves too, that it's been a process there over the years where we scraped away additional money within departments because they tended to build reserves within each department. This way, by having it in this area, it's a controlled number, and the administrator looks at it, and quite frankly, we make the departments operate as though it doesn't exist. It is our goal when we move through it that every dime of that dollar will be at the bottom line and it'll fall down at the end. There are things that come up, like you said, you get another snowstorm, stuff like that, it falls into the category we got to have somewhere to go because we haven't left room in Public Works budget to handle. They don't have any reserves at the end. They run out, fuel prices jump high, goes up 50 cents a gallon, and they were budgeted at $3.25 and now $3.75. We don't just stop all our fleet. We have to have a resource to go to, but the department does not get a function as though that money's in their budget. They got to come and truly justify a dire need, and then we determine whether we just stop something or we put the money in it.
Well, and to continue that, the new budget policies that this group adopted in December is not only does that fund come directly to the administrator's desk, but it also comes, depending on what it's for and the amount, it comes to this body. So we have an opportunity to review the expenditures of those reserves as well.
So I actually have a question then, Lou. So what, just to make sure I'm clear, what you're suggesting is that there's a $5 million reserve fund established in addition to the
Well,
10% general fund balance.
I actually, the other day I had a commissioner say, if I was king, this is what I would do. And maybe I'll use the same language. I'll say if I was the budget analyst for the king and I had unlimited authority, I would build that $5 million in. I don't expect to, but I would like to be at a level more than 750,000.
Yes, Commissioner Townsend.
Thank you for clarification. I had a question about the 750,000, or, how is that, or is that replenished in the event you have one of these contingencies? So you have a horrible snowstorm this year, and you expend from this reserve.
Yeah.
How is that replenished, or is it replenished the
Okay.
following year?
During the course of a budget year, the budget that you adopt, in this case, that $196 million budget for the general fund, $260 million for all funds, but it's a fund level budget. We cannot exceed, under Kansas statute, the amount of money that we've authorized in that budget. So let's say, because of events that occurred during the course of the year, rather than spend $196 million, we have no other alternatives, and it's going to cost us $198 million to get through the course of the year. We have to go, if that were to occur, we would have to go through a formal budget amendment process. We would have to publish notice of public hearing and amend our budget, and hopefully somewhere within existing fund balance or something, we were able to amend our budget to cover those additional expenses. We haven't had to do something like that. We might move expenses from one area of the government to the other to make certain we stay within the budget authority that's been adopted.
Let me try to answer your question a different way. I think as we're going through the year, so like 2013, if we had a $775,000 reserve account in there and we ended up spending $300,000 for it, of course, we end the year, what's left is that $400,000 that's going to fall to the bottom line, and that goes into our fund balance that will carry over into the next year. So then in 2014, we have another $775 in place. So I think maybe this is where you come in. If Public Works is a great example. Right now, or police or fire, if they had high overtime rates over and above what we expected to spend for the months of January and February, you would start to look at that and think, well, let's go ahead and take reserves and give them money, and then we'd need to replenish. How we operate that is we say, you departments, you're going to fund that from your budget because you got a 12-month budget. So they have enough room to fund it through the early part of the year. So we don't start tapping into our reserves at this point unless there's some special project that we were told to go do. We make the departments operate within. So most likely when we get to the revised budget during the summer for 2014, the 775 may be intact. If we've had to spend 75 or 100,000 out of that, we will build that item into that department's budget. And then ask to say we still want to have 775 in reserves to make it through the end of the year. So it just doesn't automatically replenish. We have to make a conscious move to build it back up because we would have moved it out into a department budget for the expenditure earlier in the year.
Dave needs a microphone there.
But globally, you're heading out of the black area into the red area. So if you spent the 750 and you were at zero, then the next year, the only way to replenish it is raise revenues, cut expenditures, because your rate of decline has been accelerating the last 2 years.
Okay, and I guess that was my
That's good.
concern or fear, trying to understand that we either replenish that by robbing Peter to pay Paul from some other, or do something with the revenue stream, or do something with the expense stream, or a combination of both. So it's not, okay, thank you.
That's right. Okay. Let the record show Lou Levin wants a $5 million reserve fund,
If he were king.
if he were king.
If I
Or the
worked for the king.
If you were
Patty, I think that was it, Patty.
That was it. Any other questions for Mr. McGilvery, I guess, before he heads home?
Lucky duck.
You're welcome to stay until 2. We,
Ann?
Yeah,
Miss-
so I do have just a couple of questions for you, and I can probably get these also individually, but if the rest of the commission is interested, the mayor made a good point last Thursday when he asked, I said something, and I guess I wasn't clear enough. Our regular, day-to-day sort of capital improvements, maintenance, our grind and overlay, we are debt financing a percentage of that work, correct? Okay, so what I want to know is what percentage of the amount of money we debt finance every year is day-to-day operational capital improvements, roughly?
well, we're not allowed to debt finance operations, is that correct?
Well, I guess there'd be two, here again, trying to flesh out the question. When you
Right,
say capital outlay, that generally applies, it has a useful life more than one budget year. So it's not like snow plowing or street sweeping, it's a structural change that extends the life of an asset. So that's what when you say capital
That's
outlay
what
in
I'm
this discussion, so you have that.
right. As opposed to economic development and special projects. I'm just curious, what normal stuff that government is supposed to do, that has to do to keep operating, how much of that makes up the debt that we issue every year versus the special projects or the
Like
other?
star bonds is a special project.
Like, for instance, a grocery store.
That's
If
right,
we're providing general obligation backing for a grocery store,
that's right.
though, if you take the economic development projects versus our capital outlay projects, what are the percentages? Is that right? Okay.
That's right.
Yeah, I think it's primarily just the basic essential assets. On an individual case-by-case basis, the commission decides, do we want to provide our GO authority to back certain TIF projects or even special development agreements. In the case of this last financing related to the Walmart, specifically in Argentine, we issued GO debt. That was a policy decision to help with the environmental remediation associated with that development. We look at those on a case-by-case basis. We've done backing. We've provided that general obligation pledge towards the acquisition and redevelopment of the Midtown project. So it varies. I think we've had on certain residential projects that are TIF related, we've provided backing.
If we had, could we get a chart, and not today, obviously, if we don't have it ready, but I think the commissioner's question is a good one. Could we get a chart that shows of our total, we have $28 million in outstanding debt. What percentage of that is related to asset projects versus related to economic development projects?
That's right.
And in addition to the amount, what percentage of our debt payment, an amount of our debt payment is committed to asset development versus committed to economic development? Because I think what's going to be interesting is when we issue general obligation bond for an asset, there's a revenue stream that backs it. It's because you know what I'm saying? Like for the Walmart,
That's where I'm getting to. That's where I'm headed, right there.
so if we can get that breakout, because what we're going to see is we have more, go ahead, Lou.
2014 budget, this is our city bond and interest fund, and we've broken down the debt by the type of debt. GO debt, 19 million out of the 27 million. Yeah, this is the annual debt service, not the amount of outstanding debt.
Thank you. That's a good clarification.
Enterprise fund supported debt, primarily sewers, It's essentially sanitary and storm sewers. There is some debt associated with the public levy and golf course. Where do we go? Associated with that $4 million. 2.8 million is TIF-related debt, so that would be the economic development related.
Okay, but this is, just for clarity for me, it's probably very elementary, but I have to sort of think out loud here. So walk me through this just a little bit, but back up. So general obligation debt, I would just say, okay, so other than property tax and sales tax that we're currently bringing in, we don't have another source of revenue for that debt. Don't say too many words. Don't give a long explanation. I just want the short one.
Yeah.
Is that
Dave, do you
accurate?
want to answer that? Yeah, go ahead.
Two responses, not looking at this. For the economic development debt, you have three types. Pure revenue, which has nothing to do with this. All the star bonds are over here. They have nothing to do with this because they're funded by sales tax revenue bonds.
Right.
Then you have, on the other part, GO, TIF bonds, which are over here. And those they're backed by property taxes. And I would say if you look at this table, and you look at what were you doing, 2014, and you look at TIF revenue, it's $1.8 million. If you look at TIF debt service, it's 2.8. So that's $1 million gap that's coming from property taxes.
Okay, so let me just say it in my very simple way, which there's probably 100 exceptions, but, so if we're issuing.
Oh, absolutely.
It's one thing to issue debt on something that involves regular day-to-day governmental services.
Essential services.
Essential services. I don't want to get into what we can pay for with it, but that basically is it. So my point is that, however, when we, in most cases, the way it should go, though we know it doesn't, in most cases the way it should go, when we issue a TIF, we should be hoping that the development is risk averse enough to pay for itself, correct? And so all I'm saying is that any special projects, I just want to make sure I have this right. So any special projects that would come forward that don't pay for themselves, we had better count on raising property taxes. Is that correct?
Yeah, if we're providing our pledge to it, then the answer is yes.
I just want to be clear about that. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I mean, I think it's right clear here what Dave alluded to. We have, in TIF revenues here, we have 1.8 million, and our debt service associated with those TIF developments is more than that. You know, we're hopeful we'll end up getting a little more than this number, but
Right.
we have to be prepared in case that we don't, that we're going to support it, and we're going to support it from property tax revenue.
Is there enough, is this a strategy? Is there a way for us to increase the number of TIF, after we just said we were going to set stricter policy, but is there a way to increase our debt on TIF projects enough so that it produce more revenue than our projections and help us with our fund balance issue? Because right now you're only loaning, what, 80%, Doug? I think we've talked about this before. You're pretty strict about, even if we issue general obligation bonds, you're pretty strict, you're taking very conservative numbers. So usually, unless we know going into it it's a social good project or it's a real high-risk project, you're pretty good about being conservative to make sure we have enough money to cover our debt and then some, right? Okay, so that's my question. So is there a way for us, because we can't cut our way to growth. That's my concern. So if we're gonna grow, we're gonna have to take some risk. So is there a way to issue, and from a bond and from a financial advisor person, is it worth us, our effort to take on more TIF risk to potentially increase our bottom line as opposed to raising property tax?
Oh, there's an interesting question. I think, I think the general obligation pledge, you're saying we're putting the taxpayers at risk to levy property taxes for X, in this case, economic development. I think that, and you have, from the credit rating perspective, somewhat high debt, GO debt. So I think GO debt is a scarce commodity, and therefore you should be judicious in how you use it. That doesn't mean you don't use it for TIF, but in this case, I think if you're going to do a GO backing for two reasons. One, for TIF. One, it's risk-free, because you think the revenues are there enough to fund it on its own, that it will pay all of its debt service itself. The other one is, it is a big project, you want to take risk because of the potential future impact, and you're willing to, absorb the risk that you might have to levy. And that's a project by project. So you have to use discretionary, it's a scarce resource, the GO backing, so you have to be very deliberate when you make a decision to put a GO behind something that is not going to cash flow. Because in this one example, there's $1 million of property taxes that's going to fund these TIF bonds that isn't going to build fund balance right now in the general fund.
And go ahead, Doug.
And I think to your answer a little bit too, you have to look a little bit about the report we did on Monday on the TIF report, because this is a snapshot view, and it's a good illustration that tells you all today, this year, we're $1 million coming from the general fund to fund the TIF project. But when you looked at that chart on Monday, and if those of you that are not on the committee look at the data that was given to you for that standing committee TIF report, and you look at the bottom line, it shows you on an annual basis, we're generating, and I think this is right to what you're saying, by our investment in our TIF projects, we're generating a little over 1.5 million positive.
Right.
Now, we don't get all that this year because each TIF district is its own district. So you got to put all the money into it till that district pays off. So but when you do the average over it, it'll pay off early, and then there's additional money that comes back into the overall balance. So this deficit up here today, it is almost 100% driven by our Indian Springs project. We have to fund that now, but we haven't brought any revenue source back in, so it shows up, this is what we're having to offset.
So wait, before you go any further, so that's a part I didn't understand. Are you saying that as long as we have TIF projects, any additional revenue generated from the TIF projects doesn't go to our general fund? We have to use it to buy down the debt on the TIF period?
Unless yes. Now,
All TIFs combined
you can,
or individual projects?
individual projects have to pay each other off, or have to pay itself off before it flows out. Your biggest illustration is Village West. That is a TIF district on its own. It not show up here because it's not in the GO at all. But we know today we're generating an extra 12 million that would be locally. It generates 50 million more than is required to pay off bonds with the state portion into it. But us or the state don't get any of that money until that district pays itself off, and each individual one is the same way. They go through, you pay them off, then you can take it. Now, if we set up a TIF so you don't allocate 100% of it, a good example of that is 39th and Rainbow.
Right.
It has a tiered approach to it that we go through it, and property taxes, I think, are only in it, I gotta look back to this, or is it sales tax? One of the two formulas are only in it for 10 years, and then they ramp back. Yeah, property's in for 10 years, then it all comes, we get it all back, sales tax starts to ramp down. So even though, and that TIF's not a GO TIF, but it's an example of one, that district will exist for 20 years, but through the life of it, we will start getting the property taxes and sales taxes back out of it before the developer gets all their money paid back into the deal, which they were planning to get from the TIF.
So Dave, that seems like a pretty simple solution to help with our cash flow issue, unless there's a state statute that says we can't do that. Right now, what we're worried about is cash flow. So why wouldn't we be doing that?
More TIF districts?
No. Why wouldn't we be doing a TIF in a tiered format
Right.
where we're getting
No.
revenue back right away and we're not putting 100% of it? I mean, if we've got some high-performing TIFs, why can't we keep that excess revenue?
Go ahead.
And I do a lot of lecturing on the strategy for economic development, and here again, some of these are, your property tax and sales tax are very scarce resources. Here, 80 cents of every dollar you spend on operations comes from taxes. So how do you want to provide it, all of it, to a developer on every project? And my general answer, particularly here, is no. You want to say, in this, and not all projects throughout the unified government are of equal weight, and you have needs in some areas that are more acute than others. So, for instance, some people say, we're only going to give you the sales tax. We always keep the property tax. You don't get property tax, or the other way. Or if it's in this part of town where we really need it, you're going to get most of the money. But if you're over here, you're not, because we don't need it that much here.
Yeah, but I
So-
don't care how much they get. I
Oh,
care
yes.
about how much we're going to
No,
get
that's
to
it.
keep and use.
Property tax or sale, you don't have to give them all of it. You can say, for a given project, we're only going to give you property tax, and we're only going to give it to you for 10 years.
Commissioner, are you talking about, I want to know if we're talking about the same topic. Are you talking about lending more money so that people pay us back more?
Let's not even talk in terms of lending more money. Thank you.
We're gonna structure the deal so that instead of all the
Right.
money having to go to the TIF, we get some back.
No, there's no question that in every TIF district we have,
Right,
it's a
exactly.
percentage. So
Yeah,
when you look at, if you looked at the TIF structure at the Plaza at the Speedway, or you look at the TIF district at 78th and State, or you look at the TIF district at 18th and I-70 for Prescott Plaza, each of those TIF districts is different, and each one is more aggressive typically as you go east in terms of what is offered. So the more challenging issue on Prescott, I think we GO back that whole project, and we gave them what would be called a super TIF, which is both property and sales tax, probably to the maximum length of time. So you can do on every TIF tax increment financing, where you take the base that property was already making, and that revenue always continues to come in. So if that property's generating $5,000 in property tax right now, we will always get that, no matter what goes on top of it. Then that increment that it creates over time is both property and sales tax. Now, you can structure your deal depending on how badly you want it and how risky it is, right? You can give them all the sales tax for 10 or 20 years. You can give them all the property tax for 10 or 20 years, or you can give less. The question is each deal, because if you say, well, we'll give you property for 5 and sales for 10, they might say, well, we can't build the project with this. We have to have 10 for both of them.
No, so I'm sorry, Mayor. I understand that. I'm not talking about a deal, an individual development deal. I'm talking about the revenue coming back from the deal. Doug has to come to us and say, I'm going to use very simple numbers. Doug has to come to us and say, we're going to loan $10 million, and in order to make this cash flow, we're going to need to bring in $1 million, okay, to pay our bills, to pay the debt on this, okay? We need to make $1 million mortgage payment. What I'm saying is a lot of times, not all the time, we clearly saw this Monday night, we have some bad performing TIFs, but we have a lot of them are performing very well. The Legends, for example. So let's say we're bringing in $2 million now. What I understand, Doug, you to be saying is we have to take that $2 million and buy down the debt. What I'm saying, to solve our fund balance issue, why don't we just pay the $1 million monthly payment and keep that $1 million to elevate our fund balance where it improves our cash flow? Because that's where we're getting ourselves in trouble, our cash flow.
The state,
Go ahead.
I think those terms have to be specific in the development agreement. If we've made that pledge, if we've issued that TIF legally and we've pledged a certain revenue flow, that revenue flow has to go to pay the debt service associated with that obligation. I think probably the best example where we get significant revenue is Plaza at the Speedway. We're